At 3:14 in the morning, a young man named Mateo Reyes made 3 phone calls. The first 2 went to voicemail. The third one, nobody ever found out who answered. What investigators would later piece together, working backward from the evidence, was that somewhere between that third call and sunrise, Mateo Reyes ran. He ran down a dark residential street in Columbia, Missouri, wearing the same clothes he'd had on at the party earlier that night. He made it almost 1 full block before someone caught him. And then he didn't make it any farther at all. He was 23 years old. He had a favorite song. He had a stack of ancient history books piled floor to ceiling in his basement apartment. He had plans for the summer, and he had a secret that someone else was willing to kill to protect. This is his story. Rewind to the evening of June 3rd, 2004. A Wednesday. Columbia, Missouri sits roughly in the geographic center of the state, a college town home to the University of Missouri, with all the energy and noise and chaos that implies. It's the kind of place where summer doesn't really feel like summer until the students are gone, and even then, the ones who stay fill the bars and the clubs and the late-night diners with a kind of restless momentum that never quite stops. Mateo Reyes was not the kind of person who wanted it to stop. He was 23, a junior at Mizzou studying journalism and pre-law, and if you had to describe him in a single word, that word would probably be magnetic. People gathered around Mateo not because he was the loudest person in the room, though he could be, but because when he talked to you, he made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He had this quality, an openness, a warmth that didn't feel performed. That Wednesday evening, Mateo walked into a restaurant on Providence Road, where his friends were already waiting for him at a table in the back. As soon as they saw him, they waved. He wound his way through the room to join them, already smiling. But if you looked closely, and his friends did because they knew him well, there was something behind the smile that wasn't quite right. Mateo had been having a hard few months. It had started in the spring, when his longtime boyfriend, a man named Carter Webb, had ended the relationship. Carter was good about it, as far as these things go. He said he still wanted to be friends. He said he still cared about Mateo. And Mateo, who loved Carter more than he had ever loved anyone, had agreed to the friendship arrangement because agreeing to it felt like the only way to keep some part of Carter in his life. The problem was that friendship, in practice, meant they were still spending time together, still talking. And for Mateo, who had not stopped loving Carter at all, being around him while knowing they weren't together was a specific kind of torment that no amount of rational thinking could fix. Every time Mateo had tried to raise the possibility of trying again, Carter had gently but clearly shut it down. And then they'd keep hanging out anyway, because Mateo couldn't bring himself to stop. So he'd been lonely, genuinely, deeply lonely, in the way that only happens when someone who used to fill your whole life is still present but no longer yours. He had been trying to fill the void the only way he knew how, in the short term, meeting people online, inviting them to the hotel front desk where he worked the night clerk shift, brief and meaningless encounters that never scratched the itch he actually had. There had been one exception, a secret, complicated arrangement with an older man who was not available in any real sense of the word. That had been exciting for a while, in the way forbidden things always are, but it had run its course. What Mateo wanted, beneath all of it, was something real. He wanted what he'd had with Carter. He wanted to feel like he meant something to someone. And so that Wednesday night, like most nights lately, Mateo went out carrying that quiet hope alongside everything else. After dinner, the group migrated a few blocks to a gay dance club called Sioux Club. The music was loud the moment they walked in, the kind of bass that you feel in your sternum before you hear it, and the crowd was thick and warm with bodies. Mateo immediately peeled off from his friends and threaded his way to the DJ booth. He made his request. The DJ rolled their eyes slightly. Mateo had made the same request every time he'd come here. Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. He wasn't going to apologize for it. He left the DJ to it, went to the bar, ordered a drink, and while he waited, he noticed a man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Not obviously looking for anyone, just standing, holding a glass, watching the dance floor with a kind of quiet attention that Mateo found immediately interesting. His name was Darian Okafor. He was 26, training to be a chef at a culinary program across town. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and laughed easily once you gave him a reason to, which Mateo did almost immediately after introducing himself. One dance became two, two became five. By the time the club started winding down, they'd spent the whole night together, and the rest of the room had ceased to matter. It was hard to talk properly over the music, but Mateo had learned enough. He liked this person. There was something easy and genuine about Darian, not performed, not angled toward anything. When the club closed, Mateo asked if Darian wanted to come back to his apartment. Darian said yes. Mateo's friend Priya Chanda was their ride. As the three of them got into her car, Priya reminded them that she was having a party at her place the following night and that they should both come. Mateo glanced at Darian and grinned and said, "Yeah, we'll both be there." Mateo's apartment was a basement unit, the kind that looks like it was finished by someone who had seen pictures of finished basements but never actually been in one. Low ceilings, one narrow window at ground level that let in whatever thin grey light the sky had to offer. Not glamorous, but Mateo had made it his. The most immediately striking thing about the apartment was the books. Darian stopped just inside the door and stood there for a moment, looking around at them. Stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, wedged into every available surface. Most of them were about ancient history, Greece specifically, the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, the mythology. Darian picked one up and turned it over in his hands, genuinely curious. And then Mateo, who had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment, started talking. The Battle of Thermopylae, the 300 Spartans and the pass and the tactical genius of holding the high ground against an army that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude. Zeus and the political theology of Mount Olympus, the way the ancient Greeks understood fate. Not as something that happened to you, but as something woven into you from the beginning. Darian listened with real attention. He told Mateo he didn't know much about history, but that it was obvious how much Mateo loved it. There's something unexpectedly intimate about watching someone talk about the thing they love most. The rest of the night was good. At 10 the next morning, as Darian got ready to leave, they made plans for Priya's party that night. Darian wrote his phone number on a scrap of paper, handed it to Mateo. Mateo walked him to the door. They hugged. There was a long pause before they pulled apart. After Darian left, Mateo stood in his apartment for a moment with the scrap of paper in his hand. Maybe, he thought, maybe this one is different. There was one other thing weighing on Mateo that summer. 2 months earlier in April, he had been at a house party across town when the police showed up. The party was loud, running late, and the neighbors had called it in. When the officers arrived, most people scattered. Mateo, who had a few drinks in him and a stubbornness that sometimes outpaced his judgment, refused to leave. He told the officers in terms that were technically polite but unmistakably confrontational that he had a right to be where he was. He got arrested. The charge was obstructing a government operation. He had gone to court a few weeks later, expecting the whole thing to have been quietly dismissed. Instead, the prosecutor had upgraded the charge, obstructing a government operation by physical interference. It was worse. Mateo had pleaded not guilty and told his friends at dinner that night with a kind of studied casualness that he was going to fight it all summer if he had to. But here is the part of that night in April that Mateo had not told his friends. One of the officers who had responded to the party, a uniformed cop named, as far as Mateo knew, Anderson, had looked at him across the chaos of the bust and then looked again. And after Mateo had been processed and everything had settled, that officer had found a way to speak to him privately. And what began in that parking lot, in hushed tones, with a glance over the shoulder to make sure nobody was watching, was something that Mateo probably knew from the first moment was not a good idea. He started it anyway, because it was exciting, because it was something, because when you are lonely enough, the wrong person at the right moment can feel like an answer to a prayer you didn't know you were saying. Over the weeks that followed, Mateo had confided in one friend about this arrangement, a close friend who lived in St. Louis, a woman named Deja, with whom he communicated mostly online. He hadn't given her a name. He'd described the man only as a cop. He'd said the secrecy was important. He'd said the whole thing was thrilling in a way that he knew was probably not healthy. And then, somewhere in May, something shifted. Mateo found out that the man was married, not just seeing someone, not separated, married, with a young child at home. Mateo ended it immediately. The thrill curdled into something colder. He stopped responding, he stopped taking the calls, and he tried to move forward. Enter Darian Okafor and the scrap of paper with the phone number, and the possibility of something real. June 4th, a Thursday. Priya's party was at her apartment on East Broadway, a second-floor unit above a used bookstore. By 9 in the evening, it was packed. People crowding the kitchen and spilling onto the narrow balcony. The music set to a level that would probably eventually prompt a neighbor to call the police, which everyone acknowledged with the specific cheerfulness of people who are not yet worried about that. Mateo arrived a little after 9. Darian arrived 40 minutes later. They spent the evening together, not glued to each other, but moving through the party in the easy orbit of two people who are figuring out what they are to each other and finding the figuring out pleasant. By 1 a.m., the party had thinned to a smaller, drunker crowd. Mateo, who had been drinking steadily since he arrived, was now past the warm and social phase and into somewhere quieter and more internal. At some point during the evening, something happened that nobody at the party would later be able to pin down exactly. What was clear from the interviews that came afterward was that Mateo's mood changed. Whether it was something he heard, something he saw, or something that had been building in him all night, nobody could say. But around 1:30 or 2 in the morning, Mateo was noticeably less present. He was quieter. He looked like a man who was turning something over in his mind and didn't love what he was finding. At 2:47 a.m., Mateo said his goodbyes. He did not ask for a ride. He walked. It was 11 blocks from Priya's apartment to his own, a walk he'd made dozens of times, usually without thinking anything of it. It was warm, the streets were quiet, and the particular geography of that part of Colombia, low streetlights, wide residential blocks, not much traffic at that hour, meant that you could walk 11 blocks and barely see another person. At 3:14 a.m., Mateo Reyes made 3 phone calls from his cell phone. The first went to Darian Okafor, voicemail. The second went to Priya Chanda, voicemail. The third, the records showed the call lasted 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Investigators would never be able to establish with certainty what was said in that call. What they could establish, eventually and painfully, was who was on the other end of the line. At 6:52 a.m. on the morning of June 5, 2004, a woman walking her dog along the 1200 block of Elm Street found a young man lying on the grass between the sidewalk and the street. She called 911. By the time the first officers arrived, it was obvious. Mateo Reyes was dead. He had been strangled, and his throat had been cut. Detective Simone Aguirre had been with the Columbia Police Department for 11 years by the summer of 2004. She had worked homicides for the last 4 of those years, and in that time she had developed a working theory that most murders, at their core, are not complicated. The facts are often ugly and layered and painful to excavate, but the structure underneath is almost always the same. Someone wanted something another person had, or wanted another person gone, and they made the worst decision a human being can make. The question, in Mateo's case, was, what did he have? Or rather, what did he know? Aguirre arrived at the scene on Elm Street shortly after 7. She stood over the body in the pale morning light and looked at it carefully. Mateo was on his back. His clothing was from the previous night, the outfit consistent with what his friends would later describe him wearing at the party. He had not made it home. The distance from where his body was found to his apartment building was less than 2 blocks. Whatever had happened close to home. Aguirre began with what she had. The last known location, Priya's party on East Broadway. The last known time, he'd left around 2:47 a.m. The last documented activity, 3 phone calls at 3:14 a.m. There was just under half an hour between the time he left the party and those calls, which meant he had walked at least some of the way before stopping to make them. Why had he stopped? She didn't know yet. But she held the question. The first interviews were with the party guests. Most of them had not noticed anything unusual about Mateo's behavior until late in the evening, when several of them independently mentioned that he had seemed distracted or upset, or like something was on his mind. No one could say what specifically. Darian Okafor was interviewed the following morning. He was visibly shaken. He told Aguirre about meeting Mateo at the club the night before, the real night before, the Wednesday, and about spending Thursday together and going to the party. He said that when Mateo left at 2:47, there had been no argument between them, no conflict. They'd said goodnight normally. He hadn't known anything was wrong until Priya called him in the morning to tell him. He pulled up his phone and showed Aguirre the missed call from Mateo at 3:14. "He called me," Darian said. His voice was flat in the particular way that shock makes voices flat. "I was asleep. I didn't hear it." Aguirre noted the call. She noted the others. She began building the timeline backward from the grass on Elm Street. 3 days into the investigation, Aguirre received a piece of information that quietly reoriented everything. It came from Mateo's cell phone records, which had been subpoenaed along with his email and online messaging history. The online messaging was where it got interesting. Mateo had been in regular contact with a woman named Deja Mensah, a friend in St. Louis, over the past several months. The conversations were long and personal, the kind of messages you write to someone you completely trust, and threaded through a number of them, going back to late April, were references to a man, a cop, someone Mateo was seeing in secret. The messages were cautious. Mateo hadn't given the man's real name. He referred to him as Anderson. He described the secrecy, the excitement, the complications. And then, in early May, the tone changed sharply. There was a message to Deja that said, "I found out he's married. I'm done. I told him not to contact me." After that, the references to Anderson stopped. Aguirre read through all of it twice. A cop, married, a secret relationship ended by Mateo approximately 3 to 4 weeks before his murder. A man whose real name she didn't yet know, operating under someone else's identity. She set the phone records down and sat with the implications for a moment. Then she requested the department's full staff roster. Among the 212 officers currently employed by the Columbia Police Department, there were exactly 2 with the surname Anderson. Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. They were not related. Brad was a patrol officer, 7 years on the force, assigned to the east side of town. Ted was a detective in property crimes, 12 years in, known for being methodical and quiet. Aguirre pulled the report from Mateo's arrest in April, the house party on Waverly Street. She scanned the officers listed. Brad Anderson's name was there. He had been one of 3 officers who responded to the call. He would have been present when Mateo was processed. He would have been one of the last uniformed officers to see Mateo on the night of the arrest, and one of the first to have had a reason to be alone with him, even briefly, in the controlled chaos of a bust. The pieces assembled themselves in her mind with the quiet inevitability of a puzzle clicking into place. She found Brad Anderson's locker room at the end of a shift. She kept the approach casual. Manila folder, photo of Mateo inside. She showed it to him the way you'd show someone a photo of a stranger, watching for the flicker. Brad Anderson looked at the photo, thought about it, said, "Yeah, I know him. He was at a party I responded to back in April. I arrested him." Aguirre asked if he'd seen Mateo since then. Brad nodded, said there had been one other time, about a month ago. A noise complaint had come in, Mateo had called it in, and Brad had been dispatched. By the time he got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only on site for a few minutes. Nothing came of it. Aguirre watched his face. Nothing in his demeanor suggested awareness of why she was asking. No tension in the jaw, no slight over-explanation. Either he was innocent or he was very good. She was about to let it go for now, wait until she had more, when Brad's partner walked by. His name was Officer Nico Rios, and Rios, without pausing, without apparently thinking, glanced at the folder and said something that he probably thought was funny. It was the kind of joke that certain men in certain environments make without registering that it reveals something. He looked at Brad and said something to the effect of, "That your gay lover?" He kept walking, didn't look back. Aguirre stood very still for a moment. Then she went back to her office and closed the door. Officer Nico Rios. She pulled his file. Rios was 31 years old. He had been with the department for 6 years. His record was clean. His performance reviews were unremarkable in all the ways that suggest someone working very carefully to be unremarkable. He was married. His wife's name was Carmela. They had a 14-month-old son. Aguirre thought about the comment, the way it had landed, the ease of it, which was the part that bothered her. Men who make that kind of joke usually make it because some version of it is floating around in their environment, something they've heard, something they know, something that has formed into a private, ugly punchline among a group of people. What did Rios know? She went back to the arrest report from April. Rios was not listed among the responding officers that night, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. There were other ways two people could have come into contact. She called Deja Mensah in St. Louis. Deja was in her mid-20s, soft-spoken and precise, and she cried for several minutes when Aguirre told her why she was calling. But once she composed herself, she was helpful. She confirmed everything the messages had suggested. Mateo had told her about a cop he was seeing. He'd called the man Anderson. He'd been excited at first, then conflicted, and then in May he'd ended it abruptly after finding out the man was married with a baby. Did he ever say anything that might indicate the man's real name? Aguirre asked. Anything that didn't match Anderson? There was a pause on the line. He said something once, Deja said slowly. He said he was pretty sure the name wasn't right. He said the guy's name tag said Anderson, but one time when he called the station to leave a message, whoever answered said that officer was out that day and gave him a different name. What name? He didn't tell me. He said it was confusing and he didn't want to think about it. Aguirre thanked her and ended the call. She sat looking at the wall. The name tag said Anderson, but the man's name was something else. Someone had borrowed an identity, and in the particular world of a police department, where name tags are pinned to uniforms and people move through shifts and rotations, it was not, when you thought about it carefully, all that hard to do. The confirmation came the way many important things come in investigations, unexpectedly, and through a door that opened without being pushed. Aguirre had been at her desk for an hour when her secretary knocked and said there was someone waiting to see her, a young man who'd been sitting in the lobby and said he had information about the Valencia case. Aguirre had her brought in. His name was Andy Whitmore. He was 22, a friend of Mateo's, and he sat in the chair across from Aguirre with the slightly ill expression of someone who has been telling himself he doesn't need to do something and has finally accepted that he does. He told her that a few weeks before Mateo died, the two of them had gone out and ended up back at Mateo's apartment. Late in the evening, around 2 or 3 a.m., there had been a knock at the door. Mateo went to answer it. A uniformed police officer came in. Andy had been startled. The officer swept a flashlight around, and then Mateo led him through to the bedroom. They all spent time together. Afterward, before leaving, the officer looked at Andy and said, in a tone that made clear it was not a request, "You didn't see me. Keep this between us." Andy had. For almost 2 weeks he'd kept it. Aguirre asked if Andy remembered the officer's name. He said he hadn't seen a name tag. She got out a department yearbook, photographs of every officer, organized by unit. She slid it across the desk and told him to take his time flipping through it. Andy put up a hand. "I don't need to," he said. Aguirre looked at him. "Why not?" "Because when I came in here," Andy said, "the guy I saw, he was out in the hallway." What happened in the early hours of June 5, 2004, was reconstructed over the months that followed from the available evidence. The phone records, the witness accounts, the physical evidence at the scene, and eventually, the testimony of Officer Nico Rios' own partner. Here is what investigators came to believe. Rios had been drinking with friends after his shift ended on the evening of June 4th, the same night as Priya's party. Sometime before dawn, he got in his car and drove home. But on the way, he decided to make a stop. He had been at Mateo's apartment before. The arrangement had been going on for weeks, hidden under a borrowed identity, a name tag that didn't belong to him. A version of himself he'd built specifically for this purpose. Mateo had called him Anderson. Mateo had believed for a long time that Anderson was who he was. What Mateo had figured out, when exactly and how, was never fully established, was that Anderson was not his name, and that the man wearing the name tag was married, with a child. When Rios showed up at Mateo's door in the early hours of June 5th, Mateo was drunk and exhausted, and had apparently already been turning over what he knew for most of the night. The mood changed at the party. The 3 phone calls, the 4th call, 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the contents of which were never recovered. All of it pointed toward a man who had been working himself up to something. He told Rios that he knew. He told Rios that he was done. And then, and this was the part that ended everything, Mateo told Rios that if he didn't leave and stay gone, he was going to go to Rios's commanding officer and tell them everything. Rios, by all accounts, was not a man who handled loss of control well. The investigation that came after his arrest would surface a pattern of behavior in his personal life that suggested someone who needed, above most other things, to be the one holding the cards. And Mateo, in that moment, had taken every card he had. There was an argument. Mateo tried to end it. He told Rios to get out. Rios didn't. Mateo walked out himself. He got almost a full block down Elm Street before Rios caught him. An arm around the neck, a choke applied with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been taught exactly how to do it. Mateo's body went limp quickly. The mechanics of it are what they are. Rios laid him down on the grass. He had a pocket knife in his jacket. He used it. Then he walked back to his car and drove home, making one stop along the way that nobody would witness. He disposed of the knife somewhere that it was never found. He parked in his driveway. He walked up to the front door. Through the kitchen window, he could see Carmela up with the baby, moving around in the early light, warming a bottle. He went inside. Before he did, he unpinned the name tag from his uniform, the one that said Anderson. He put it in the glove compartment of his car and replaced it with his own, the one that said Rios. Nico Rios was arrested in the late fall of 2004. The case against him was built carefully, piece by piece: the cell phone records, the messages to Deja Mensa, the testimony of Andy Whitmore, and the account of Brad Anderson, the real Brad Anderson, who had been unknowingly carrying another man's crimes under his borrowed name. Physical evidence was limited by the absence of the murder weapon, but what existed was enough. A hair recovered from the crime scene, a fiber analysis consistent with Rios's uniform, and Andy Whitmore, sitting across from the jury, pointing at a man he had met in Mateo's apartment. In May of 2005, nearly a year after Mateo Reyes was found on the grass on Elm Street, Nico Rios was convicted of first-degree murder. He appealed. The appeal resulted in a new trial. The first-degree charge was reduced to second-degree murder on procedural grounds that had nothing to do with whether he had done it. He was found guilty again. He was sentenced to life in prison. His wife, Carmela, filed for divorce before the second trial concluded. Darian Okafor still has the missed call notification in his phone. He hasn't deleted it. He told a reporter once, in the only interview he gave, that he's thought about what would have happened if he'd been awake at 3:14 in the morning instead of asleep. If he'd picked up, if he'd heard Mateo's voice and understood what was happening. He doesn't know what would have been different. He doesn't know if anything would. That's the part that stays with him. Priya Chanda moved away from Colombia shortly after the trial. She says she still thinks about the party, the way Mateo looked as he was leaving, not distressed exactly, but somewhere inside himself in a way she should have paid more attention to. She said she wishes she'd asked him to stay, that she'd offered the couch, that she'd found a reason to keep him there a little longer. Deja Mensa, in St. Louis, was the one who ultimately called the police in 2004 when she saw the news report about the murder and recognized the photograph of the victim. She had printed out the chat logs. She had the name Anderson. She had Mateo's words, exactly as he had written them, preserved in the digital archive of a conversation between two friends who had trusted each other completely. That's what broke the case open. Not a forensic breakthrough. Not a slip in an interrogation room. A friend. A printed page. The evidence of trust between two people. Mateo Reyes loved ancient Greek history. He loved Michael Jackson. He loved the way a room felt when the music was right and the people were good and the summer felt infinite. He was 23 years old and he was trying to find his way to something real, through all the wrong turns and temporary arrangements and the persistent hope that the next person might be different. He had plans for the summer. There's something I keep coming back to when I think about this case. Nico Rios built a false identity and wore it into Mateo's life. He chose a name from a department roster, a colleague's name, a man who had never done anything wrong except share his surname with the one Rios needed, and he put it on like a costume. He showed up at parties. He knocked on basement apartment doors at 3 a.m. He looked at a young man who trusted him and let that young man believe entirely in something that didn't exist. The name was a lie. The name tag was stolen. Even the version of himself that Rios presented, the protector, the authority figure, the man behind the badge, was a performance built on top of a life he was hiding. And Mateo, for a while, didn't know. Because why would he? We extend to people the basic courtesy of believing they are who they say they are. We assume the face we're shown is the face that exists. That gap between the face we're shown and the one that actually exists is a gap that most of us will never have to reckon with in any serious way. Mateo Reyes reckoned with it at 3:14 in the morning on a quiet street in Missouri, and he didn't survive the reckoning. And the thing that keeps me up about it is this: he saw it. At the end, he saw exactly who was in front of him, and he wasn't wrong to say something about it. He wasn't wrong to try to walk away. He just ran out of road.